Okay, welcome back everybody from the mini break. It's a pleasure to be invited to moderate this next panel with my dear colleagues and friends who are going to talk about clinical research that's on the go or kind of in process of development, but all pointing that things will really advance this coming year in 2019. So that's very exciting. First, I'm going to give the word to Jose Carlos, who is our scientific director at ICEERS. He's going to talk a bit about the study in Reus and kind of around beyond evidence-based medicine in Ibogaine research and regulation. He will explain what it is, Dana, don't worry. And then we will go afterwards to the other speakers. So first, Jose Carlos.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, for your presentation. Thank you, Dana, and the organizers for inviting me to this conference, and thank you all for coming here. I am the scientific director at ICEERS. Ben already explained what is ICEERS, so I will not explain anymore, but we have different programs, and these programs are based in three principles. The first one is public policies based on human race. The second one is promoting bottom-up social change. And the third one is that all of our projects are evidence-based, are based in evidence, in science. Since we work with indigenous cultures and since we work with different groups of plant medicine users, for example, with ayahuasca or Ibogaine, at ICEERS we should also question what is evidence. I think that everybody has very clear what is evidence, but I will try to deconstruct a little bit. This is the classic pyramid that explains what is evidence. In the top are the meta-analysis and the randomized clinical trials, and in the bottom of the pyramid are the ideas, opinions, and medical decisions and clinical decisions. It's very paradox that the people who take the clinical decisions that involve the results of medical practice are their opinion are in the bottom of the pyramid. It's like the medicine is with time even more protocolized, and the medical doctors and the clinicians have with time less decisions, or the decisions are more based in the protocols that based on their clinical expertise. But there is not any single evidence that this pyramid of evidence is scientific based. So I will try to explain a little bit the history where this pyramid came. In 1972, the US Drug Amendment Act instituted the randomized controlled trial as the gold standard for evaluating the efficacy of biomedical intervention. This is what some experts call the bacteriological model. If you have a disease, an infection, you take an antibiotic and you cure your disease or you die. But this bacteriological model is difficult to translate to the other areas of medicine. And if we think about psychiatry or about psychology, it's very difficult to understand that if you give someone a treatment, this person will get cured. Probably something is happening in the mind that is related with the change. In 1972, the institution that was before FDA recommended that to start randomized clinical trials, but was not a requisite. These institutions accepted other kinds of evidence. With the construction of the pyramid of evidence, the clinical experience of clinicians and disciplines such as anthropology or economy are override by randomized clinical trials. And biomedicine becomes hegemonic as source of evidence, and other sources of evidence like anthropology or economy are displaced. And the Single Convention on Narcotic Drugs in 1971 sets up the dogma of drug policies based on medical evidence. In order to change the schedule of one drug, you need to offer evidence based on the biomedical model. The biomedical model used to find evidence in the harms and the risks of the drugs. But by example, the anthropologists know very well that drugs in many cultures has a prosocial effect. So by example, they don't take into account the studies done by the economists or by other disciplines. And if we base the decisions regarding where to put a certain drug by example, in economical analysis, instead of in biomedical decisions, maybe these decisions in order to move drugs between schedules could be different. Well, there are different models that have been modified in order to talk about the hierarchy of evidence, but all of them, there are some models where taking into account qualitative research, by example, but all of them put in the top of the pyramid the meta-analysis and then the randomized clinical trials. But this hierarchy of evidence is, with time, getting questioned. Why? Well, because clinical trials have a very well internal consistency, but a very pure ecological validity. What happens in a clinical trial is very useful in order to what is happening inside of the laboratory, but when a certain drug goes out from the laboratory to the street, the behavior of the substance start to do strange things. This is why, with time, there are some epistemologists that start to questioning this hierarchy of evidence. And now we are moving what is called real world evidence. That is to get data from the clinicians that put the results that they find in their clinical practice into the database with statistical analysis based on big data. We can start to obtain and generate evidence that is more rich and have more validity, ecological validity, external validity, that clinical trials. And this is something that, by example, is starting to happen in the field of cannabis. There are some researchers that are creating protocols in order that in those countries where medical cannabis is legalized, clinicians can start to compile data, and with this kind of analysis, we will have in the future more solid and ecologically based regarding the effectiveness, the tolerance, and the efficacy of medical cannabis. And this is something that can be done also in the Ibogaine field. There are too many clinicians around the world, and many clinics. If these clinics work with the same protocols, in order to collect data, this data can be analyzed using big data analysis. No? This is also because there is a crisis in biomedicine. With time, it's more expensive and more difficult to release new drugs into the market. This is, by example, in the 70s, to develop a medicine costs around 100 or 70,000 millions. $70,000, and now you need at least $1 or $2 billion in order to develop a medicine, since the laboratory to the final phases of the clinical trials. This is why we need to start in new ways of collecting evidence in order to, because it's almost impossible for independent researchers, like is our case, to develop a medicine, to transform a medicine into a drug into a medicine. Well, there are some obstacles for research, scientific ideologies, like I told before, political ideologies. It's difficult to obtain funds in order to do research when you are looking for medical results. Bureaucracy is awful. public policies is another obstacle sometimes, but if you have money, you can solve all the obstacles. And there are 4 examples that I overview a little bit regarding that have been escaped from the biomedical pharmaceutical development. One of them is cannabis, the other one is cannabidiol, CBD, the other one are hallucinogenic mushrooms, and the other one is Ibogaine. Well, all of you know about cannabis. Cannabis break all the pharmacological rules of the biomedical development because we are talking about a plant that have 100 of different compounds, some of them add in different form, even in antagonistic form, but since 2014, the single convention, the INCB recognized the medical use of cannabis, and this is why today there are several dozen countries that have medical cannabis programs. One of them is Portugal, like Maria told you before. This is a map that we developed in ICERS. It's an interactive map. If you want to know the situation of medical cannabis in some place of the world, you can go to this country, to this continent, and you can read, and you click, and you go directly to the law. You can search this map in cannabis.com. And recently, the Parliament, the European Parliament, released a resolution inviting the different countries of the European Union to start medical cannabis programs. Well, the other example of how when civil society can get organized, can obtain a change in the law is what happens with CBD. This is Charles Fick, a little girl with epilepsy, and this was a picture in Brazil, and this was a picture from another girl in Mexico. That when the mothers and the fathers organized it, they obtained that the different agencies recognize CBD like a medicine. Now there is a drug. Epidiolex is a medicine developed by GW Pharmaceuticals, but before the approval of Epidiolex, there were in these countries approval for using CBD in the treatment of child epilepsy. This is another example. There are more evidence-based in clinical practice with CBD that the evidence that we have from the clinical trials. So sometimes with cannabis and CBD, by example, sometimes the expertise and the evidence and the knowledge that we have for a certain drug or compounds is beforehand than the clinical trials. Hallucinogenic mushrooms are the same, or almost the same. There are evidence that psilocybin can be used for the treatment of several diseases, and since this can be happen, there are several popular initiatives. For example, in New Mexico, to grow hallucinogenic mushrooms was not illegal since 2005, and there are several similar initiatives in Colorado, in Oregon, and in California. Let's see. So these are other examples that show when social society asks for change, it's not necessary to go to the biomedical model development. And what is happening with Ibogaine? Well, we talked before about the crisis of the opioids, both in US and in Canada. In Europe, it's not an epidemic problem yet, but it's growing with time. And we also know, by example, in Spain, there was a conference the other day in Barcelona about the network of people who work in drug addiction. And we have now a problem of old people that start to enter into methadone maintenance programs in the 70s or in the 80s or in the 90s. And now, after 20 or 30 years, they are using methadone. And now we don't know what to do with them because we assume that this is a chronic disease, like diabetes or another or whatever other chronic disease. But we know that methadone have when the doses of methadone correlate inversely with quality of life. So this is a systematic review that we did with Rafael and with Jaime, our colleagues in Brazil, where we review all the evidence regarding Ibogaine. Now there are two other researchers that was presented before yesterday or the first day of the conference, and also all of you already know that the evidence that came from the animal models is enough. So with this evidence, we are starting to think in developing clinical trials. So, but at the same time that we are developing clinical trials, well, we start, we published a case report also with Clare and with Rafael, in which we started to test low doses of Ibogaine for the treatment of methadone dependence. And after this, these are the figures for the doses that we administered. After the first dose of 150 milligrams, the withdrawal syndrome decreased, but after 5 hours, the symptoms start to increase again. And we were combining the administration of Ibogaine with the reduction of the dose of methadone. In this way, we could detoxify this person, increasing the doses of methadone, of Ibogaine, at the same time that we were reducing the doses of methadone. So we have a clinical trial in Spain that we will send this month to the ethics committee in order to show how this model works in a clinical trial. A double-blind, placebo-control, etc. No, it's not placebo-controlled because in one group we will increase in the dose of Ibogaine in the same manner that we saw in the clinical in the case report, and in the other group we will keep the 100 milligram dose. Well, this is one of the studies that we are developing, and we are trying to obtain some kind of evidence of this model in a preclinical trial in which we will look for proteomic in order to see what are the brain networks involved in this in the eventual positive results. This is the study that Jenis and Murtaza presented in the talk before, and this is the study that Rafael Guimarães will present later. He's the principal investigator of this study, in which we will use Ibogaine in the treatment of alcoholism in Brazil. And we are also constructing a rating scale in order to assess the Ibogaine subjective experience that Maya Kohek presented the other day also. And I will last my presentation talking that we are suffering a crisis in psychopharmacology. There are new molecules since 30 years ago, and the molecules that we have to treat major depression, by example, or PTSD don't work and have lots of secondary effects. So probably psychedelics are in the field of mental diseases, and Ibogaine in the field of drug dependence could came to cure to psychiatry from its crisis. There are several papers that show that maybe psychedelics can be a treatment for this crisis, and also in neurodegenerative disorders. We know that if we don't find something that stops at least during 6 months the Alzheimer's disease, the public system, the public health system, as we know today, will disappear in 2030. These are figures from the World Health Organization, and we know that Ibogaine and other psychedelics can be useful for treatment, by example, Parkinson's disease or Alzheimer in the case of other psychedelics. This is a study that we did, we published it in 2015, when we saw that people who use ayahuasca regularly have brain modifications in the cortical thickness. So, and there are some evidence. Maybe it's necessary to start to research these substances if we want to. So what are the challenges in research if we take into consideration what I talked before? Well, that biomedicine will have to coexist with other disciplines and even with other knowledge systems. Evidence-based medicine cannot be only sure of evidence in public policy. The regulation of controlled drugs can also come from society and not necessarily from randomized clinical trials exclusively. Medical judgment, patient's experience and science evidence must fit each other. Freedom for research is necessary in order to front contemporary public health challenges such as psychiatric and neurodegenerative disease, and bridging endogenous and scientific knowledge and a multi-evidence-based approaches are necessary when studying traditional plant medicine. This is something that I omit because I didn't have time enough to explain a little bit. And I invite you to come to the ayahuasca conference. And thank you very much.
I don't have nothing to talk now.
Do we want to give some time to any questions right now for Jose Carlos before Rafael talks about his study in Brazil? Yes. Is there another mic, or we just have one mic?
I would like to ask you, you said briefly about the qualitative research role in evidence. Can you share your personal opinion about the qualitative?
Well, I have changed my opinion since I don't work in a hospital. So I was a very supporter of clinical trials, and I was doing clinical trials during almost 10 years. And now that I do not clinical trials, I support other kinds of evidence. So I have no. So, well, and I understand your question because we have discussed quite a lot regarding this issue. And well, we are doing now qualitative research. For example, this research with this process for constructing the questionnaire. We interviewed, and some of you were helped very much in order to contact with Ibogaine providers and in order to contact with people who was treating with Ibogaine. We interviewed them very, very deeply in order to analyze, since from a qualitative perspective, what are the main contexts. This is what Maya talked the other day. And using this data, we will construct this Ibogaine questionnaire. But we also, well, you are analyzing the data from the Temple of the Way of Life, the study that Deborah is leading in Peru with ayahuasca users. And with time, we are trying to combine different types of evidence. Rafael will present the protocol in Brazil. Janice and Murtaza presented the protocol in Afghanistan. So I'm not against the clinical trials, but I think that we should start to combine different kinds of evidence. And qualitative research is very important. And the research that came from anthropology is very important. Why is very important now for me and for ICERS to work with qualitative and with other disciplines and methodologies, because we are starting to collaborate with an Amazonian group that use ayahuasca traditionally. So if we are anchored in the biomedical model, you cannot go to the jungle and say to the shaman, please give to your patients a placebo and let's compare it with active principle. We need to start to think about new methodologies. In fact, in the ayahuasca conference in Spain, we will do a workshop in which we will try to combine different kinds of knowledge from the indigenous people with the scientists and so on. And we are working now in creating new methodologies that when we went to the jungle, we can obtain data respecting the traditional knowledge. So in ICERS, this is our goal for the next future, to start to combine different kinds of evidence, to try to create dialogues between disciplines and not only between disciplines, but also between different sources of knowledge.
Thank you so much. It was very interesting. I went to Psychedemia, which was co-sponsored by University of Pennsylvania Medical School like 6 years ago. I forget if anyone else was there. And one of the points that was made by the Johns Hopkins psilocybin people was that their institutional review boards were more open to doing psychedelic research because people had gone through had lived through the 60s and 70s and taken more of that. Does that make any sense, or does that feed into your perception of why some of these drugs have?
I think that one of the reasons is that they are at Johns Hopkins, and Johns Hopkins is a very well-recognized institution. But sometimes we think that the US is the only country where psychedelic research is done. But by example, in Europe, the psychedelic research never stopped. By example, the group of Franz Vollenweider in the University of Zurich were one of the first one in doing brain imaging studies since the early 90s, or the group of Jordi Riba or Rafael, or the people at the IMIM in Barcelona were the first in the world to start to work with MDMA. This is funny, and we was talking about this issue yesterday when the people at the Johns Hopkins published the first study. This was a very classical pharmacological study. They administered psilocybin to a group and compared with methylphenidate and assessed with rating scales spiritual experiences. But you can rate spiritual experience, but you can also measure another kind of experience, for example, subjective effects. It was just a study of subjective effects. And it was published in 2006 in Psychopharmacology with 7 editorials. And since the early 90s, the people in Europe was publishing very well designed clinical trials, and nobody take care of, and nobody learn about these papers. So I think that things are changing. I think that psychedelics are also almost mainstream. I said almost. By example, we know Compass is starting the clinical trials in order to develop psilocybin into a prescription medicine. MAPS is doing the same thing with MDMA for the treatment of post-traumatic stress disorder. So it's not difficult to see. I think that in 3-4 years, we will see at least 2 drugs into the market, psilocybin and MDMA. And I think that with Ibogaine, it will be a very bit different because we are just at the starting of the clinical trials. I hope that in the few years we can conclude all the clinical trials and go further where the studies that we are doing. But I think that the Ibogaine community now in US, when this crisis, opioid crisis, if civil society start to organize and ask for the government in different states, like happened with cannabis and what is happening with mushrooms, probably you will see in your country that Ibogaine can be used for medical uses without going ahead of the clinical trial phases.
How could that be?
What?
They're going to allow us to use Ibogaine without it being approved?
Well, this is what I explained with that happens with cannabis. With cannabis, there are no clinical trials. When they authorized medical cannabis in more than 30 countries, in Uruguay, they never did the clinical trials, or CBD, cannabidiol. The clinical trials of cannabidiol were published last year, and CBD is able for medical conditions in US since 3 or 4 years, or in Brazil or in Mexico. I want to explain in my presentation that it's not necessary for certain drugs. If you want to develop a drug from the beginning, it's necessary to go ahead with all the clinical trials. But we are talking about drugs that have been used for centuries. And by example, with cannabis, we already know we don't need more clinical trials, by example, to assess pharmacokinetics, because we know that cannabis is a very safe drug from a medical point of view. In the psychological aspect, it's another issue. But in a medical aspect, Yeah, it's different than cannabis, but there are several ways of regulating. Maybe, by example, this is what happens in New Zealand. In New Zealand, Ibogaine is recognized as a medicine in order to use it only in clinical settings.
So a lay provider can provide it, a doctor writes the prescription, and a lay provider can administer the medicine.
Well, yes, there are. Yeah.
Doctor is involved but does not.
Yeah.
It's quite loose.
Yeah, but or in South Africa, we have examples of some countries where the different legislations allows medical doctors to administer Ibogaine, and they didn't do clinical trials. So it's possible. I think that civil society should organize in order to ask for the governments to allow the, at least in this moment where we are, every day dies 200 Americans in the US. So it's now or never when civil society should organize. Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. So we're going to pass to Rafael Guimarães, who's going to talk about a study in Brazil around alcoholism. Maybe worth mentioning that in 2000... Sorry? No. He can stand up. He can stand up. He can do it. Exactly. Exactly. So just maybe a little anecdote. Some of you might know that, but in 2010 there was the Gita conference in Barcelona, and then there was this day at the Health Ministry of Catalonia about Ibogaine, where many of you were present. And at that moment, Rafael was working in this research group, also with José Carlos and Jordi Riba in the Hospital São Paulo. And it was at that event that this ex-boss, now at the time, said, you know, we're going to do a clinical trial here with Ibogaine. No? So that was like a big victory. Unfortunately, 3 months later, he had a heart attack. He died from a heart attack. And that was kind of the end of that. The new leadership wasn't going to push that study forward. But now then he went to Brazil, working in a research group there. And now, about 8 years later, there's kind of a following to that. So that's really very special. And so I'm going to let you present about the study.
Good night now. To me, then Maya, José Carlos, Ben, it's a real gift to be here with you. I'm kind of emotional today. Well, yes, we are friends in many years, and it's a pleasure. Our ex-boss died, and I was now working in São Paulo. I was like 5 years to get this ready. I was like constructing my name, my reputation before I really worked with ayahuasca before that, and now it's we hope we can do things really well and help people with this. So thank you, Dana, for allowing me to be here, for the invitation, José Carlos, my everything. So I am at the advisory board of ICEERS, and I am professor now in this department. We work with several compounds there. I will show you a little bit about that. I will pass rapid this. The good thing about being a good friend, having a good friend like José Carlos, is that you do not have to agree always with him, and that can still be fun to work with him. So yes, we have what I like about a systematic review for those of you who do not know what it is a kind of a way of putting everything, both negative and positive, about certain topics. So it's a thing. I like to do systematic reviews because we have the opportunity to discuss all the evidence there is, not only the positive or the negative, and the pharmaceutical industry have not been always transparent about this because negative results were not put in this meta-analysis. But like José Carlos said, the animal evidence it's very consistent about the Ibogaine reducing the use of several drugs. We see aquí amphetamine, opioids, and alcohol, which replaces these are two paradigms in animal models, the most common used to try to see the effect of drugs, the self-administration, the conditional play preference, where animal, usually rodent, a rat or mice, has to be near or a drug to see if it works in really to start to reduce drug use. It seems the best evidence it came from here. Jose Carlos also showed this. We tried to fulfill all these criteria, including everything we could find, not only on PubMed, but also what we call sometimes gray literature that's not always published in peer-reviewed journals. And what we can observe really is that most of the protocols were open label with single high doses. We have this, most did not found a really adverse effects, but you know better than me that they can happen. And this we do not really control what happened here. Sometimes there are private clinics that you do not have complete access to the information, and most are doing our no open label and are in private clinics. We have this group in New Zealand that is starting to use Ibogaine, pure Ibogaine in randomized trials, but unfortunately they did not find a positive result, at least with these doses and protocol, and they did found a significant K2 interval prolongation, which is a main issue with Ibogaine. Yes, we have more recent review, but what we have today is like we have 33 registered deaths associated somehow with Ibogaine, at least this 76, 72 hours. Not all are fatal cases, but we have cases of deaths, and most of the cases are related to K2 prolongation. So it's an issue, we cannot ignore it. It's a reality. And we also have this case reports of people with psychotic episodes with Ibogaine, and also seizures and mania. So it's not a compound to be playing with. Let's put in these words. Maybe people can drink ayahuasca more freely, psychedelic mushrooms, cannabis, but Ibogaine is more delicate. So it's a huge victory for us to could put this as a clinical trials. It's like a stamp for us, some kind of victory. Let's see what we can do in the future with this. We are also proud that all the money we are using are from the Brazilian government. We do not. I am not here representing any pharmaceutical. I am not representing individuals. These are the main agencies in Brazil that develop research in all the countries. So this is all made with money from the Brazilian government, and I could not be less grateful to ICEERS than Jose Carlos for the idea came from here for them. So we have the opportunity to execute, but the mind is him. and why we are doing this? How can we convince the ethics committee? This is a very low dose, but as far as we can tell, and if I'm wrong, you can correct me. This is the only controlled, published in a peer-reviewed journal with ethics approval, and the source of Ibogaine. This is the only one that we have until today. So we use this dose to convince the ethics committee that this dose is safe, because all other doses we are mostly based on empirical knowledge, and to convince an ethics committee on that ground could be difficult. So we decided to approach it very carefully and use it. We will start with this dose, and even if we do not found efficacy result, we at least can show that we will increase to 400 milligrams, that these doses were safely evaluated in a clinical context, which is what the regulatory agencies usually ask for us to do. So we can see how the Ibogaine, it really accumulates in the body. This is part of the rationale for the protocol that I'm going to talk about. This is the other group, the same study. You can see that there's no alteration on psychological tests with 20 milligrams. Some modulation of cognition, but really it's a dose that was safely administered and did not cause mostly subjective effects. So that's why we start with this dose. Jose Carlos already told that this is the source of our ideas, this case report, of increasing dose with time for Ibogaine to not accumulate in the organism. It could be dangerous. So why alcohol? In Brazil, opiates, until today, they are not a problem. We do not have heroin in Brazil. We do not have fentanyl, but alcohol, not only Brazil, but in all South America, it's the main, together with crack today, but alcohol, it's a very huge problem in Brazil. Teenagers start drinking it very early. University parties, they are increasing doses of distillated drinks, rapes associated with alcohol, booze, and this party. So, and we are a very alcoholic society in a way, because our main football players, singers, and sometimes even politicians, they made propaganda in the television. Hey, beer is nice, and with everybody is beautiful in the propagandas. Nobody has problems, and alcohol, it's really a dangerous substance. There are some experts that say that from a society point of view, alcohol is much more dangerous than other drugs. Together with crack and heroin industry, including alcohol and tobacco, they are can be very harmful for our society, not only for individuals, but for our society. And we do not have efficacious treatment available. These are the main drugs used to treat alcoholism, and many of them are used for long periods of time. Patients, the fact is that no good evidence that these drugs are effective treatment to alcoholism. And including the hangover effect, is this negative stimuli. I'm feeling bad, but it's not enough to keep people from drinking and abusing alcohol. So this is the main reasons that we also look at for alcohol and not crack. Crack dependence in Brazil, also the population is very young, more difficult to reach, more impulsive. So we really want to try something with a more traditional problem in Brazil than crack cocaine. So where we are located, this is Brazil. Brazil is separated in several states. This is São Paulo state, and we are in Ribeirão Preto, which is at 300 kilometers from São Paulo. It's a small city, well, small in Brazil. 1 million people live there, so it's a small city in Brazil. And this is the beautiful place where I work. I really like to work here. It's one of the hugest hospitals in South America. Many people from other states come to this hospital to get treatment, because here we have some very good physicians specializing in very difficult things. For example, this year, a neurologist here, Dr. Helio Machado, separated the Siamese in English? Siamese twins. So, and we have all a large group of scientists that are very known, not known in Brazil, but around the world, and we work in this institution. And it's very rich to work here, because this is the hospital, but all these are the pharmaceutical faculties that we work with preclinical models. So it's an institution when we can dialogue between these two fields, and usually they are separated, so we really have the opportunity to do interesting things here. So this is the setting where we are doing the study. We are in the Department of Neuroscience and Behavior. We are a group. I am very proud to be among the group until today that most produces in cannabidiol research, CBD research. So we have several clinical trials with cannabidiol and also case reports. We can use neuroimaging and evoked potentials. It's a very complete hospital, and we have these services. The Ibogaine study that we are going to start will be done in the psychiatric clinic. It's in the 3rd floor of that building you saw. Professor Jaime is, as like Ben said in the beginning, if it was not by our boss, Manel Barbanó, the line of investigation stopped here. So Professor Jaime is really someone very special. He's very keen to this kind of research, and he's very bold to doing this kind of research with no fear of doing dangerous drugs and these things. He's a fantastic man. As I told you, I did my PhD in Barcelona with Dr. Jorge Riba, And this is in Brazil. We were the first ones to do an open label trial with major depressive disorder patients, treatment-resistant. They had tried at least 2 different antidepressants to be resistant, and with a single ayahuasca dose, you can see that depressive symptoms were reducing significantly over time with a single dose, like 3 weeks of effectiveness. Nobody had saw that before, only with ketamine. And we also did neuroimaging showing that the ayahuasca dose increased the blood flux in these regions associated with emotional processing, which is also what we see with traditional antidepressants. So it seems somehow that they crosstalk ayahuasca and traditional antidepressants at the neuro level. This is Professor Jaime and Professor Draulio de Araújo. It's a partner of us in the University of Rio Grande do Norte in Natal. We just published that. The first one was an open label. This is a randomized trial with 29 depressed people. And you can see, I really like this image because you can see the placebo, how powerful it can be. It follows ayahuasca very closely, the placebo. It only differentiated statistically at day 7. This is only a single dose. Our next steps in this line of research is doing more research with more volunteers and different kind of clinical populations. As I said, Dr. Zuardi, to me, few people know that, including in the cannabis field. Dr. Zuardi is like our Mestre Yoda, because in the 80s, he was already publishing things on not only in animals, but also in humans, showing that cannabis were not only THC, was CBD and other things. So we are the group that actually most produce on cannabidiol. Until today, we have studies with anxiety. We are doing now one with major depressive disorder, psychosis, and Parkinson's disease. In fact, Parkinson is our line of investigation that we are most involucrated now in doing with cannabidiol. And Professor Kripa, Jaime are my supervisors in this line of study. So this is the protocol that we are doing. We are going to establish people with at least 2 failed treatments with alcohol. This is not so difficult to find in Brazil. We are like to thank Phytostan, which is now in Brazil for Bob Cisco here, for giving us the Ibogaine that we are going to use. In fact, we are for 1 year still waiting for the Ibogaine because Anvisa, which is like the FDA in Brazil, it's a very bureaucratic institution, more bureaucratic than scientific. And we are based exactly as Clare will explain, and Jose Carlos, on this protocol of increasing doses. So we will be 12 patients. The first 3 will receive 20, 40, 80, and then we will increasing until we reach this higher dose, 400 milligrams. And if this dose is well tolerated, which we think will be, we will randomize 9 of these volunteers to these 3 groups of these doses with placebo in different combinations. This is a fixed schedule, but they will be randomized to that. And we also have the opportunity to measure not only the subjective effects, but also endocannabinoids. That's a line of research that we do for many years. BDNF, it's a neurotrophic factor that seems to be involved in the antidepressive effects of ayahuasca, ketamine. And we will, of course, be very cautious about the cardiovascular events. Since it is a institution with it's a big institution, we will have a specialized cardiologist who will work with us. We have one of our psychiatric students. She knows very well how to interpret the electrocardiogram to know if there's a Kitsu problem or anything like that. And this is the shadow. So we are not, the alcohol withdrawal and abstinence already has a protocol to be done. So volunteers will arrive in the hospital as any psychiatric patient there, will pass to the abstinence period in a nursery, in a psychiatric nursery with the protocol with benzodiazepines, and because of the risk of convulsions and delirium tremens. And then only after this period pass that they are going to receive Ibogaine. So what you can see in black marked here, every patient will be internated. It says internated in the unit for 20 days. So we will be able to monitor their health, and they're not going to be allowed to use any other compound, any other drug. And we will slowly increasing the doses, and every period we will apply the subjective scales and the electrocardiogram. And when they leave the hospital, we will also ask how they felt about the treatment, because something that is becoming more and more common in these clinical trials is asking about the quality of life of these people, more than just symptom reduction. We want to know if they are satisfied with the treatment, and if it increased their quality of life. So I am here more to questions than to give answers. These are Professor Jaime, Professor Flavia is a psychologist who is also very interested in these compounds. These are my two students. I put these 4 people because we 5 will be the ones that are going to be administering the study, preparing the papers, and all the other part of the treatment will be done by the nursery, in the psychiatric nursery. And then I am not a physician, so I'll be present with the patient, but the treatment itself will be done by the medical personnel. So we have this opportunity to akin to what Jose Carlos was talking, that where I work, it's let's say a real life hospital, because people are not going there just to do clinical trials. People live on the area. They come back to do ambulatory visits. So, and we have a lot of freedom to approach these people and to develop this protocol. So we will try to see with time if we can or increase the Ibogaine dose and get more close to the reality of the Brazilian society. People maybe in the future, they can go to a hospital or a clinic and can take a safe and tested dose with Ibogaine and to several drug problems. So now we start with alcoholism, but the future is for crack too. Our ideas including crack in our protocols. So I do not have much to say more. I'd like to thank you again for the opportunity, and I think the richer part would be that after Clare talks, that we can talk among each other and learn more about our different experiences. So thank you.
Thank you. Maybe before we pass on to Claire, is there a question?